Welcome. My name is Gilad Berenstein, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the AI and Faith podcast. On this podcast, we'll bring together experts from our community and thought leaders from around the world so that together we can learn the key lessons required to building a world where AI benefits humanity and all of us individually.
There's a degree to which AI, by its nature, is going to be developed as quickly as possible. Are there ways that we could create guidelines or guardrails on that development so it's done in a way that's not destructive, right? I mean, that's a concern that is out there, right? So when people hear that, they begin to go, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then I say, well, these religious traditions in shorthand have some very common ethical standards that we can all draw upon and agree upon.
Today, I'm honored to bring you an exciting conversation with a very special guest. As some of you may already know, we at AI and Faith have been growing, and the organization has been maturing. And with that, the time has come for us to bring some new leadership on board. And today, I feel very fortunate to get to introduce all of you to our new executive director. So let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us today, especially before you've even begun your first day on the job.
Really happy to be part of this conversation, and thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really exciting to have an opportunity to introduce you in a slightly longer form to all of our members and, of course, to the community around the world that we're engaging with. So to get started, I'm hoping you just tell us about your early life. Where did you grow up? And tell us a bit about yourself as a kid.
Well, I grew up in the Silicon Valley in a non-religious household. So what we would today call a household of nuns, right? N-O-N-E-S's, right? When you check the box, what religion are you? It would be none of the above. We had in the family a great love for philosophy, literature, and ideas. And so eventually, and I can describe that to you, that opened the door for me to connect those interests with Christian faith and thinking and theology and that whole bundle of things.
Yeah, incredible. And tell us a bit about that. How did you discover religion? How did you discover faith? And then maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and your faith today.
Well, for me, it was really about a searching. So the punchline goes like this: grow up in a household of nuns, go to Berkeley, and become a person of faith. Those three things don't add up together, right? I went to UC Berkeley at 17, and I was really searching out some different sense of what is meaning in life, where do I find love, and that sort of thing. And I looked at through the great religious traditions. I took a class in religious studies. I talked with friends who were compelled by their own convictions of religion, or not, by the way. And out of that, I found myself really compelled by the call of faith. And in my particular case, it was the call to Christian faith and to becoming a Christian. So it was my first year, my second, at that point, quarter at Berkeley, that I started that journey. And out of that, there was a lot of challenge to my faith. I was living in a fraternity, so it was fun, but there's a kind of ethical challenge, you might say, and even some fairly strong verbal challenges from people about, why are you doing this Christian thing? What's that about? All that sort of stuff. But also within the classes I was in at Berkeley, which I loved, just deeply loved, there was also the challenge of, secular culture, meaning culture outside of religion, has moved beyond any kind of religious mooring for good intellectual reasons, some of which come from science and technology. So how can you still hold to this outdated philosophy? So that was how I became a Christian. And that's also how I became a person that really wanted to engage the culture of ideas and what science and technology, how they are part of that stream of culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And were you unique, or were there other people on campus who were finding religion and finding God at the same time?
Well, I mean, I felt a little bit, I guess you can't really qualify a superlative like unique, but I'll still say it. I felt a little
Yeah,
bit unique when I was
yeah.
walking downhill from the fraternity house to where I would worship at First Presbyterian Church. I felt like I didn't see a lot of people walking from their Greek houses, but certainly there were other people that I knew who could come alongside me in that connection of faith and culture and philosophy and science and so on. Honestly, some of the best contributions came from people who had grown up in faith, but actually may have rejected it or were kind of sidelining it at that point.
Yeah.
One of them was my friend Mark, who was in a lot of my literature classes. And I remember him because he grew up in Southern California, had like this connection of reading Hegel and Kant ancient Greek, but also surfing. That was the kind, but didn't believe anymore in what he'd been taught as a kid. So that was also, in a way, a contribution to my development and also a challenge, I think, that I was trying to respond to.
I find that the college time is so interesting. Coming from a Jewish tradition, so much of what we do is around the life cycle, it's around the annual cycle. So you almost grow up, if your family was engaged in Judaism, being engaged without ever really having to ask yourself the questions of, am I choosing to be engaged? And then you see people going to college and now being like, do I want to go to synagogue for the holidays? Do I want to eat certain things or other things that people who are Jewish do? And I just find that whole discovery that happens in college to be such a fascinating experience for people, especially like we said, being able to, for the first time, to discover for themselves what they believe in as opposed to what they kind of grew up with at home.
Right. I mean, I think that's that, psychological time of differentiation. So you're
Yeah.
trying to figure out is what you were given by your family, what part are you going to take, what part are you going to put aside? And for me,
Yeah.
in a way, I wasn't given religion, I was given non-religion. I always say our kind of family philosopher was Ayn Rand, the objectivist and the atheist. And that was what I grew up with, the virtue of selfishness, that whole idea. And then just the culture of Silicon Valley, which was we can make things happen on our own. I grew
Yeah.
up 5 miles from where the personal computer was created by Jobs and Wozniak. So that was so much in the air about, hey, why do you need religion in a world like this?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get back to modern time at the end here, but I think that's what's so interesting about being a religious leader in Seattle today, almost regardless of what faith you are within, is that your congregation, your community are building the future of AI right now and asking these really important questions of, am I living my faith? Am I living the ethics that I believe in? So I think it's a really fascinating time. So you touched already a little bit on technology and science. How did you become interested in that? And maybe tell us a little bit about how that and the religious interest kind of came together.
For me, it was that connection was one maybe more presented as a challenge to start from the culture outside, from the academic world of science and technology have shown us why religion is outdated. And that's a very common cultural meme, honestly. And now that I'm in university teaching, it recurs again and again. And,
Yeah.
and certainly there's some truth to it. So I don't want to completely reject it. But that was the first challenge. At the same time, a couple of positive things had happened. My dad was an engineer, and I never forget this. I don't know if you remember those old Coke glasses that were narrow at the bottom and bigger at the top. So, as an engineer, and actually a really fun guy too, I don't want to make him sound like a crank or anything, but he'd say to my brother and me, Marcus and Greg, those glasses are highly unstable. The center of gravity is far too high, right? I don't even know when he said that, at what age, but it was that sense of learning how the world worked. That was really something that was important and fun, right? So that got me into science and to a certain degree into technology. Secondly, in my own faith tradition, I was going to a Presbyterian church, as I mentioned, and it was very culture engaging. So, let's talk about the preaching pastor would bring in the scientists he knew from UC
Yeah.
Berkeley and like what they were doing with biochemistry or quantum cosmology or whatever. So it was very culture engaging. So I had those positive aspects. It really, though, was a little bit later when I started doing some postgraduate work at the universities of Heidelberg and Tübingen that I began to look at two different thinkers, one coming from a scientific perspective, one coming from a reformed Christian perspective, and how they related to one another. That started this. That was like 35 years ago. And then after that, starting my PhD at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And, that's such a center for this engagement of science and technology. And currently, really, AI is part of that,
Yeah.
and, religion. And let me just put in there really quickly, because so far I've only talked about mainly my identification as a Christian thinker or a Christian as a Christian. At GTU, at the Graduate Theological Union, all study, even if it's for Christian theology or philosophy of religion, is interreligious. So already decades ago, I was doing this work in an interreligious mode, you might say.
Yeah, I love that. And I love also when you talked about the different thinkers and different schools of thoughts in class, it really made me think of AI and faith. And really,
Mhm.
that our strength is that we bring such diversity of people who are really thoughtful about their religion, about their ethical tradition, and also their professions. And bringing that into the conversation, I always find to be the most rewarding part of being a part of AI and faith. So you touched on your PhD just a little bit. So maybe tell us a little bit more. What did you study? What did you do during your PhD time?
Well, I'll say one thing that always stands out to me. And again, I was really connected with at first with science and faith and how those came together. Of course, technology for me is a related
Yep.
field. I actually put technology and science fairly closely together because of the breadth of science and the breadth of technology. So that's a just so you know, we could of course
Yeah.
have that kind of academic conversation, but I see a real connection there. So, in one of the first classrooms, Robert John Russell, a leader in science and theology, was teaching us about quantum cosmology and the relativistic physics and how those related to the teaching of creation in the monotheistic framework. And I remember my mind was like, boom, this is amazing. You know what I mean? Because he was making these connections that enhanced the understanding of my own religious tradition and others' religious traditions, and he was such a person who had mastery in both areas. So that got me energized. So that was one of the first areas, that first moments where I really saw that. My dissertation advisor is Ted Peters, who's connected with AI and faith, and as one of the advisors or experts. And he is also one of those people who brings that curiosity about faith and technology and science together. So in my dissertation itself, I looked at the scientist and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who was very involved in the mathematics of the development of relativistic physics around, let's say, the turn of the 19th to 20th century, and then Karl Barth, who was a Reformed theologian. And I said, well, in what way does coming from science and technology and from below, as it's called in the Guild, how does that relate to somebody who comes from above, meaning from revelation, from how they see, the revelation in the Christian scripture and the Hebrew Bible? How do they relate to one another? And so my dissertation was on bringing those two into conversation, you might say, and what differences and similarities they shared. It took me on a path really of just listening a lot, listening to them, of course, but through the years, the 4 years of my PhD, hearing great scholars come to Berkeley, seeing projects that were connected with GTU or people who were related to GTU, that is the Graduate Theological Union. It got my ears open. That has been this ongoing listening, and as I feel, led or as I've been called to be part of it, engagement in that science, technology, and religion conversation.
Yeah, that is awesome. We'll have to have you back on the podcast for an episode just to focus on that piece of it specifically. So tell us a bit about your early ministry and what you did after you finished school.
So right after I finished my PhD, I started at a church in New York City, right in Midtown Manhattan, on Fifth Avenue and 55th Street, and that was my pastoral ministry was connected with young professionals and with adult education. So as far as young professionals, this is just gives context for it. I had this tremendously great problem that there was this really dynamic preacher named Tom Toole at the congregation, and 250 new members were joining the church every year, and
Wow.
150 were under 35 years old, like 20 to 35. And so when I came in, they're like, "Help us, work with this demographic." So that was just so exciting, you know what I mean? And then secondly, because of the nature of being in Manhattan, we had people engaged with like Columbia University and other centers of learning there. And so we had this really robust adult education program that had 95 5-week classes every year. It was like written up in various publications. I don't need to like brag on that, but it's super
Yeah.
fun. Got some
Yeah.
attention, and it gave me this ability to bring in scholars who were scientists, technologists, but also every year to teach on science and technology and Christian faith, and just got that conversation going. It was really,
Yeah.
really fascinating.
Incredible. And then tell us a bit more of your career. How did it progress from there?
So then I came to Chico, which is in Northern California, where I live now, north of Sacramento, about 20 some years ago, to be in another post, similar kind of church in the sense that it's a downtown church. In this case, we're right next to a university, different sized town. Chico's about now 120,000 people, surrounded by like mountains and lots of nuts, as it were, meaning almonds and walnuts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes, of course, that becomes its own joke, but
All
um,
of the above.
yeah, exactly. And then 10 years ago, or actually 11 years ago, I transitioned to teaching, moving away from my full-time work as a pastor, teaching in the University of Chico State, and also managing a couple of grant projects, fairly large grant project, $2 million 3-year grant projects on bringing together faith and science, especially connected to emerging adults, 18 to 30-year-olds. So that was where I focused for about 10 years. And then I inserted co founding a nonprofit called Science for the Church, which brings the insights of science to Christian congregations. And then they asked me to come back to Bidwell Presbyterian Church part time. So I've served as pastor 4 years ago in 2021. I came back. Yeah. So there's this blend of different things, but it had in it either full time or part time pastoral work, teaching the university, managing or guiding, co-directing projects in faith and science, and then also being part of a nonprofit that is related in that same way.
Incredible. I mean, this is obviously so well related to the work we do at AI and Faith. So tell us a little more about the nonprofit and specifically like what you've learned when you have brought science and technology into religious circles or religious spaces.
Yeah. And by the way, I forgot to mention some publications is related in the last 10 years. So we'll get back to that. But
Yeah.
that brings in the multi-religious format as well, or connections. So in Science for the Church, I mean, I just learned a lot about, founding an organization and how that works. How do you bring in stakeholders into that organization? So to go back a step, almost every church, and certainly the ones I've been a part of, are nonprofits. The tax designation is a 501c3. So I've been in 501c3 organizations for a long time with board
Yeah.
of directors and that sort of stuff. But to found your own, you really get to know what the nuts and bolts are about. Liability insurance, excuse me. How do you register with the state that you're in? And particularly, how do you gain stakeholders, people who are committed to your organization?
Yeah.
So one of the things I did was a training with the Murdoch Trust in fundraising, and fundraising is probably one of those things that gets people a little uncomfortable, and I understand why. But at its best, it's connecting with people who say, "I really like what you're doing. I have some resources that I could share with you,
Yeah.
and I want to do that." And
Yeah.
so the fundraising that I've been involved with, for example, with Science for the Church, has really been those conversations of I like this organization, and I want to give, I want to be
Yeah.
part. And so it can be a really joyful experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And then tell us a bit more about the publications.
As we prepared for our time together, you mentioned talking about publications. So I'm only saying that just so
Yeah,
people know
please.
I'm not just pitching myself, right?
Of
But
course.
But I've published, I think it's 8 books over the past, I don't know, 15 years or so. And those have been primarily in the area of science and faith. Most recently, though, the last publication is most relevant for this particular job with AI and faith, which makes me so excited. And it was a book on science, technology, and religions, looking, decentering the conversation of science and religion. In other words, so much of the conversation of science and religion has focused on Christianity for understandable reasons, probably because of that's still the majority religion in our country, but it's distorted some things. And so I was like, well, I go back a step. Also, I've been teaching this class for 11 and a half years on science, technology, and religion at Chico State, and that was why I was recruited to go to Chico State, is to teach that class. And my students kept asking, is there a multi-religious book? And I'm like, not really for an undergrad. There's a couple that are very higher level, more for specialists. And so
Yeah.
I ended up writing this book from a multi-religious perspective, decentered, as I said, meaning there wasn't a central faith. It wasn't like, here's Christianity and then other religions. It's like, let's look at each of these traditions and even spiritual but non-religious persons and see how they relate to science and technology as an introduction. And in each of those chapters, what was really important for me is I had a specialist that I've gotten to know over the years to tell me, how do nature religions, so indigenous
Yeah.
religions, Native American traditions, neo-paganism, how do they relate to science and technology? Give me, in a way, the backstop. What are the things that I want to make sure I don't make a mistake in? That's kind of the minimal thing, but
Yeah.
also give me the content. What are the issues that you think are most important, for your religious tradition? So that to me was a book that I'm taking a little bit of time with because it relates so directly to this position. Where, with AI and faith, yes, I come as a Christian. That is my identification. And I'm so engaged in what is AI looking like for other traditions and what can I
Yeah.
learn, for goodness sake? What can I learn from others?
Yeah, absolutely.
One,
I love that.
I think of this image, which comes from Karl Barth, that Reformed theologian I mentioned way back a few minutes ago. He said, whenever you're talking about somebody else's position, you want that person behind you, imagine in your imagination, nodding agreement, like you are
Yep.
representing me accurately. And so, in teaching at the university, particularly, but other places, of course, I've tried to do that. I tried to do that in the writing of this book to say, and this is why I engage the specialists. I want to say, if I'm talking about Judaism and science and technology, you're going to say, yeah, this actually represents fairly what a Jewish person would say about
Yeah.
this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say that's one of the many things I'm so excited about having you join the organization is how entrepreneurial you are. I love the story of the book didn't exist, so I wrote it. That is what an entrepreneur does. And of course, I'm a bit biased being an entrepreneur myself, but of course, I think that's a really wonderful trait to have in the nonprofit world where we don't always have entrepreneurial leaders within. So it's one of the many reasons I think we're so excited to have you join us. Then the other point that you made that really resonated is on the podcast, we've talked a little bit about Native American religions, and specifically some of them in Canada have oral tradition where they do not believe in writing down their sacred texts or their stories that are really meaningful to their faith, and talking about how can we build technology, how can we build AI that not only fits into their religious tradition, but even elevates or enhances it. So thinking about, are there AIs in that tradition that could be verbal only? They have to interact with through conversation and things like that, while still honoring all the things and keeping the stories living. So I love kind of your whole point about how do we learn from the real core of what they're doing and help bring a future of technology that benefits all of us, including all the different religions. So I love that. So before we run out of time, I do want to talk briefly about AI and faith. So when do you officially start?
Well, I officially start October 1st. So I am really excited. But as you probably know, I've been ramping up in the weeks before that to just get to know people, which has been
Yep.
so incredible. And also to learn enough so that when I represent AI and faith, I'm saying things accurately. Back to
Yeah.
the book in a way. Like I want to make sure I present AI and faith so an advisor or stakeholder of whatever sort says, yes, that's accurate to what we do and what we are committed to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you're still learning, so we don't expect complete answers here, but any elements of the organization you're most excited to engage with, any new initiatives you're thinking about, anything you can share with us from kind of the early thinking you've already done?
Well, let me just start by saying what I understand to be the core or one of the core elements of AI and faith is how do you engage with AI ethically and thoughtfully, from various
Absolutely.
perspectives. And I don't mean to be too bland in that, but I think that is such a key element. So, a couple
Yes.
stories related to that. One is I was just with some friends or acquaintances the other day, and I was talking about my new position, and their immediate response, it's not always the immediate response, but their immediate response is, doesn't AI kind of go against religion? Aren't those kind of antithetical? And my immediate, first of all, of course, I listen. That's the most important thing. But
Absolutely.
well, actually, I think there's a lot of engagement that can happen. And,
Yeah.
I begin to unfold, well, here's some Buddhist perspectives on AI. Here's some ways that Father Paolo Bonatti, who I was just with, how he looks at it from the Catholic perspective and his role with the Vatican. Here's how I look at it as a person who's a Christian. And then you go, well, there's a degree to which AI, by its nature, is going to be developed as quickly as possible. And
Absolutely.
so, are there ways that we could create guidelines or guardrails on that development so it's done in a way that's not destructive, right? I mean, that's a concern that is out there, right? So when people hear that, they begin to go, "Oh yeah, that makes sense." And then I say, "Well, these religious traditions have some I think in shorthand have some very common ethical standards that we can all draw upon and agree upon. And then we have that diversity you talked about. Even within my tradition, which has apparently 2 billion adherents within the Christian tradition, there's lots of diversity. Religious people in the world, we're going to have some variation. And how do we bring all that together with AI? That's fascinating to me. The second
Yeah.
story then is when I was at the Graduate Theological Union, the Human Genome Initiative was happening. And part of the Human Genome Initiative was a funded 1%, as I recall, that was for theological and ethical engagement with the implications of the technology that was being developed. And so the Graduate Theological Union was one of the places where that conversation was happening. And that became a paradigm as I thought about this executive director role for great. Could we get 1% of the funding of AI? That would be amazing, right?
Dream outcome.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But more so, could there be a way in which we're part of these conversations? And
Yeah.
what I think is amazing is, yes, that's happening with the 200 plus advisors. And like you, Gilad, you're engaged in these conversations of a developing technology, right? I'll just put a little thing why I say developing. The theory of evolutionary biology is still developing, but it's pretty baked in many ways.
Yeah.
AI is not fully baked yet. And as that baking is going on, I can extend this metaphor. Got bakers, right, in the kitchen, and they can
Yes.
help with what comes out of the oven. Now, that metaphor may not have taken us where we need to go,
No, no,
but I
you
love
are
that part,
touching.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You're touching on my why. I mean, at the end of the day, the reason I'm engaged with this organization is because I truly believe that the more voices, the more perspectives, the more insights that can be a part of this conversation, the better chance we have to develop AI that benefits all of us. And
Yeah.
like you said, completely right. AI is coming and it's going to change our world. There's no debating that. It just is. And the question is, in what ways does it change our world and who can influence that? And needless to say, it's clear to me, and I'm sure it's clear to our whole community, why the board was so excited about having you join the organization in such an important role. And I think being in Silicon Valley is another really good benefit to helping us really engage in these conversations where I think our members, our experts, and our greater community have a lot to add.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and I do feel like there's been this great as in mean very encouraging reception to me. I love that,
Yeah.
And I'll just say one other thing because I started my life after college, before my theological study, in entrepreneurial role in retail. There's also a reason that I think I understand profits. I understand what companies are doing. I think there's a for-profit part of this, right? If companies developing AI can help religious sectors feel more comfortable with their product.
Yes.
And I know we've talked about some kind of seal that would be this has been approved by a multi-religious,
Yeah.
body, whatever that's called exactly. And there's
Yeah.
different conversations we are in, as I understand it. That would actually also be good for the companies from their perspective, of how this works in the marketplace. So
Yeah.
I don't want to be too Pollyannish. There's a lot of challenges, but maybe we could work toward a win-win. And I see that in the advisors and experts I'm already engaged with AI and faith.
Yeah, I completely agree. And to your point about that stamp of approval, I think that's also beneficial to people not of faith who trust that there's going to be ethical guidelines and guardrails put in place. That even if they're not personally people of faith, I think it's actually going to be the type of rising tide that can lift all boats. And like I said, that's why I'm so passionate about this organization, why I'm so excited to have you join us. Now, before I let you go, we do have a lightning round question. Three short questions, 15 minutes, 15 seconds apiece. Well, I'll kick it off. So my first question is, what is one of your favorite personal use cases for artificial intelligence?
This is going to be a little bit of a confession, but sometimes when I've got a sermon that's about to happen and I just want to get a overview, I will do a search, saying in the theology of Greg Cootsona, what about this topic? Tell me in a paragraph or two, and that will get my juices going and give me some guideline for how to develop it.
I love that. I actually did the same thing with my own writings. Okay, next question. What are not enough people talking about in the world of artificial intelligence?
I think people are talking too much about doomsday scenarios, although
I
they're really
agree.
interesting and very fun to put into movies. I'm actually also really interested and concerned about the environmental questions related to AI. So I feel that I hear that more on the edges of the conversations I've been in.
Yeah,
I'd love to see more about that in the center.
absolutely. That's a great answer. And then last, would you want access to an AI priest, pastor, other kind of faith leader?
Yeah, I mean, there's already Text Jesus in the Christian tradition, which is a phone app, which I have used from time to time. It gives a decent answer. So if that's the kind of pastor, AI pastor, yeah, I'd use it. It wouldn't for me replace an actual human being, but it could be a supplement.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much for joining our organization. I know we're all so excited to have you with us. And to all of you in the AI and faith community, thank you for joining us. And we can't wait to have you with us again next time. Stay tuned to listen to more conversations and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share it with your friends so they can join this important conversation. Don't forget to also follow us on social media. We are on LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky. Thank you for joining us.